ready to record on my
There it is.
Oh, now it's going.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Foam Frat podcast. Tyler and Sam talking about the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And Sam put out a blog, God, it was probably over a month now, about the curve, the oxyhemoglobin curve, the dreaded curve. And the blog was amazing, but it brought back like PTSD from, what was it, Fast 19 or Fast
18 or 19?
Fast 18, where Eric and I were going to try to explain the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve to an audience, and we were going to have them vote on who did it better. My way of doing that was going to be rapping to Vanilla Ice. And I had this whole like, all right, stop and think about it for a moment. Life without hemoglobin, crazy, chaotic extraction from your O2 cellular attraction. Will it ever drop? Probably not. We got to find, see, I already screwed it up. It was,
Dude,
will it ever stop?
Keep going.
Probably,
keep going.
Will it ever stop? Probably not. You got to find a way to prioritize the drop of O2 off the hemoglobin. 3 things to keep the O2 flow and heat. And then I went through like heat and then acid or hydrogen.
Hey, if you break character again,
CO2.
I'm going to be really pissed.
What's that?
So if you break character again, I'm going to be really pissed.
I know, dude. I keep
going.
I keep talking to the camera. Like, what do they call that? The third window, or breaking the fourth window?
Breaking the fourth wall.
Breaking the fourth wall. Yeah, but I had this whole like rap and then it went to garbage. But I was reading it and I had to adjust the rap because you had a part where you said 2,3 DPG is not like a crowbar. And that was like my mental model, and I never bothered to question it. And I always thought like, yeah, the 2,3 DPG, like, pries that oxygen off of the hemoglobin. And then you were like, no, actually it doesn't. Like, it doesn't even do anything until after the oxygen's gone. And from that deep dive you did into it. And so I was like, oh, this is cool. And I read through that entire blog probably 3 or 4 times. That's because
a long time, because that was a long blog.
It is. And I probably, spot read parts of it. But it was excellent. And what I really liked about it was the application into the clinical setting. Like, how can we actually apply this knowledge? This isn't just something that you need to memorize for your FPC exam or whatever. This is stuff you need to know and have like a working fundamental knowledge of it. Mm-hmm. And it really comes into play when we talk about airway management. There's so many things that relate back to the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. But the thing that I really thought that we could dive into and zoom in on is the way that this applies to us performing a intubation or airway management. And so I thought the first thing that we could kind of start to unpack a little bit is the rate in which we desaturate. Because when we were coming up with some talking points about this blog, you had said, it's not a linear correlation. It's not like you drop from 100% to 90%, the same rate that you go from 90 to 80 and so on. So let's start off with that and tell me why that's the case. Why is it just not a steady drop?
Yeah, so it's not, I guess if you were to summarize it, the drop in saturation is not linear, and it's not really live either. I think when we're looking at an SpO2, we imagine that, like you said, if the patient, let's say we've done a really good job pre-oxygenating, this patient's in, I don't know, the high 90s or something. They're in the high 90s, and we're going to perform an anesthesia on this patient. And maybe we still even have nasal cannula going, and we do the apneic oxygenation, and we've, recruited the lung, and we're just doing a really good job. And let's say we start the airway procedure and we take everything off the patient. Maybe they still have apneic oxygenation on, but maybe they have some pulmonary shunt or something. Maybe they got some, atelectasis that occurs right away due to some, I don't know, pulmonary edema or pneumonia or something, and the patient starts to desaturate anyway. And they go from 97 and they drop to 87%. In your mind, you might think, well, that took 20, 30 seconds or 40 seconds or so. And I'm still, maybe I'm handling this airway still and doing things. We might mistakenly think that, hey, the rate, let's say it took them 30 seconds or something to go from 97 to 87. The mistake would be thinking that they're going to go from 87 to 77 at the same time period, like it's equidistance, like from each other, but it's not. And it's because of the shape of that curve. And that's how that blog starts off, is that it's a sigmoidal curve, which looks like an S stretched out. And so they kind of start on this really flat area, but then it takes a huge downward turn. And as soon as we get past that approximately 90-ish%, high 8, depending on what kind of curve they're on, really high 80s, really low 90s, right around, kind of just gravitating around that 90%, that's when you really have to be careful, because after they pass that point, they are going to go down, and they're going to go down quick. And SpO2s are not live. Like I said, we think that it's linear. It's not linear. It's also not live, because there's pulse ox lag, and it depends where you read, and it also depends how sick the patient is. But I mean, just to assume that you're probably getting, I don't know, you're probably 15, 20, 30 seconds behind at least.
That's interesting, because we were debating amongst some of the clinicians the other day. Like, if you were intubating and your SpO2 was like down to, like, let's just say it got to like 90%, and you were already in the airway and you could see the cords, and all you had to do is drop the bougie in, would you still pull out and re-oxygenate, or would you go through with that intubation if you could already see the cords? What would you say?
How fast did they drop? Where did they start? And it's relative, because
Yeah.
if they're going down really slow, or maybe they were, at 91 or 92 or 93, and now they're finally at 90, and it was really slow. That's one thing. But if they were at 100% and they dropped really fast to 90, I'd be thinking, man, the actual saturation is probably 80. And if I take any longer, this patient's going to be screwed. So I don't know. If you're right there at the core, are you talking about like you got the tube in hand and you see the cords?
Yep, you see the bougie. Maybe this was a little bit more. We'll say it was a difficult airway. You're having a hard time getting it, and you look, and they're like, "All right, SpO2 is 90%," and you can see the cords. You got the bougie, and we'll say that you're, I don't know, a minute or so into it, and you started off at 96, 97%, and now you're at 90%, and you can actually see the cords. Are you going to go through with it, or are you going to say, "Let's back out and let's oxygenate," knowing about the pulse ox lag?
You are probably on the edge, because here's the thing: just because you have that that's a really tough question, because initially I want to say I'm just going to put that tube in because they're not that bad, but just knowing that they're a difficult airway, visualizing it is only part of the battle. The next part of the battle is going to be placing that tube, playing with the bougie, trying to get it up into the airway. Maybe I hit the anterior trachea. Then I've got to troubleshoot the tube. Then I have to actually, advance it. Somebody's got to pull it out. Somebody's got to inflate it. And then there's going to be a problem. Somebody misplaced the connector. And then, it's going to be one thing after another. So it's easy to think like, let's just toss that tube in. But if they're that sick and it was a really difficult airway, I gotta imagine you have to pull out at that point. Now, in the heat of the moment, would I make the same decision? I don't know, because I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about every possible angle while it's not in front of me. I don't know what I would do in real life, but like right now, while I'm not doing that skill, logically, I would say in that patient, pull out, because there's still a lot of game to play in that airway if you haven't even tried to pass the tube yet.
Yeah, I'm in the same camp. And like you said, when you're in the moment and you're like, "Oh my God, I can finally see the cords," that may be a little bit different, because you're like, "I don't want to have to do that again." But pulse ox lag, if you're at 90% on there, you're down into the 80s. We know we're at that tipping point of the roller coaster where you're going to start going down fast. And, you're still prone to human error. Maybe you thought it was the cords, but it isn't. It's something else. And now you're really setting yourself up for failure. So me, I'm going to pull out. I mean, I love first pass success. I think that's great. But if it's at the risk of hypoxia, then, like, pull it out. I'm going to re-oxygenate them and then do it again. That's my mental model. I just don't. I think it's probably just from talking to Jeff Jarvis so much. Like, first pass success is great. We know a lot of things happen, like complications after that first intubation if you don't get it. But you can't risk hypoxia and all
Yeah.
the badness that comes along with prolonging that first attempt, and it's all relating directly back to that oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So I 100% agree with that. In excuse me, in the blog, we talk about, I say we like I wrote it, you talk about regional versus systemic shifts, right shift or left shift.
Mhm.
And I think when I was going through paramedic school, this concept didn't really get explained to me properly, because I thought of a right shift as like a global right shift. Like the
Mhm.
whole body is acidic. You're not your affinity for oxygen on hemoglobin is decreased, and you basically are just throwing O2 out into the plasma, and
Yeah.
nothing's really getting like triaged or prioritized like it should.
Mhm.
And I was just like, man, like at first it was like, oh, so the oxygen's like readily available to the cells. That's cool. But then when you start
Yeah.
thinking about it, it's like, yeah, but all of that oxygen, I mean, it's probably really simplistic, but I'm like, how's the oxygen going to get to my toes? Like it's going to get
Yeah.
eaten up by the body before it even has time to get to like the distal places, which is why you need to triage that. And so
Mhm.
there's a difference between a regional right shift and then a systemic right shift. And so I love the illustration you had in the blog of the regional right shift, or whatever shift, and you related it to working out. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So basically the difference between a regional and a systemic is essentially the difference between physiologic and a pathological state. Because in a physiologic state, my body is doing that triage, and essentially what's happening here is like if an area of the body, in the blog I use the example of somebody doing like leg extensions, because I always think about that as like you really get the burn going there. Your quads really get hot when you're doing like leg
I only do
extensions.
arms, so I don't know, but
Yeah. Well, anyway, there's this thing you sit on, you lift your legs forward. It's
I've heard
really
about
great. You
it.
should try it. Forget about it. So, um, if that area, let's say your quads, or you're doing squats or whatever, and it gets really hot, that's one thing. That temperature is one thing that shifts the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve to the right. So is CO2. So is a low pH. All those things happen in an area that's requiring a lot of oxygen, right? And so it's an ingenious system, the way that it works, because all the byproducts of hard work attract oxygen. And that's how the hemoglobin know, oh, hey, look at all the CO2 hanging out. There must have been a ton of metabolism here. It's really hot over here. Like clearly some work is going on. And man, look at that pH. It dropped over here. There's some lactic acid being used up or whatever. And then the hemoglobin knows like, okay, this is the spot where we should shift. Obviously, we've been shifted to the right. Our affinity for oxygen is now decreased. Let's drop off the oxygen here. That's a physiologic state. And I guess you could build on that a little bit more and say, like, let's say I'm breathing really hard and I'm really exerting myself doing this workout. Let's say I'm doing leg extensions. I'm breathing really hard. Globally, my CO2 is probably decreased, and I'm putting myself into an alkalotic state. That's going to make sure that oxygen isn't delivered to my bicep, because I'm not doing curls right now or chin ups or something. It's not gonna get dropped off here. This is gonna be on more of a left shift, where the hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen is very high. So it's gonna be like, okay, not doing too much up here. Let's not drop it off here. It seems to be very cold, maybe not cold, but relatively cool. There's not a lot of CO2. The pH isn't low. Seems like we don't have to drop it off here. Let's hold on to it for a little bit. They're breathing real hard. My global CO2 is down, but in that one area, my CO2 is high. It knows to drop it off in that one area down in my legs. And so that's really important when we think about that's the physiologic state. That's how my body operates normally. But in a pathological state, the body has no idea. It's not like this one muscle that's working out, where there's this swift change from a normal curve or a left curve all of a sudden to a right curve, where it's like, oh, I got to drop it off here. If the patient is, we'll talk about maybe a right shift first, which is decreased affinity for oxygen. For those of you who are kind of like newer to this topic, right shift means, yeah, we're dropping off oxygen, we're not holding on to it, everything's hot, acidic, CO2's high. If the whole body is, let's say we have a really bad acidosis, or the patient can't It could be a respiratory or metabolic acidosis. So maybe there's a ton of CO2 in the body. Maybe there's just like barely any bicarbonate. Maybe the pH is really low. The body has no idea where it's supposed to be dropping off this oxygen because it thinks that everywhere needs it. And so it's just free handing it out just all over the place. And so that's kind of like the difference as far as right shift goes, at least. That's the difference between, yeah, what the body would do physiologically, which is kind of regional, and what the body would do under a pathological state or otherwise, kind of globally.
And so with a left shift, the oxygen actually has, or the oxygen has a higher affinity for hemoglobin, or is it the hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen? I guess is a better
Yeah.
way of saying that.
Yeah.
And so I always think of, excuse me, I always think of this as like your carbon monoxide poisonings, where you can't get the oxygen off of the hemoglobin and it's just like floating around, and it's like I don't know, a real tease to all the cells because they see it,
Yeah.
and it's like, there it goes. It's like in those movies when somebody's stranded on an island and you see like the plane fly over and they're trying to get their attention and it just keeps flying. That's how I
Mhm.
imagine a left shift is.
Yeah.
The cells want it, they can see it passing by, but they don't get it.
Mhm.
And there's things that it's like the opposite of what would cause a right shift, right? So you're going to
Yeah.
have a increase in pH, or an alkalotic state, a decrease in CO2, and then you're going to I feel like you don't see that as much. Like that left shift doesn't seem like it happens as much. But now when we're talking about how it regionalizes, it probably is relatively left compared to the muscle that you're working out,
Yeah.
like you had explained earlier.
Yeah, some of the more common ones that I guess we would see for like a global pathological left shift might be if somebody was, maybe the most common one is like puking. If you lose like, but only puking, not like vomiting and diarrhea, because obviously you lose bicarbonate out of your butt, you lose hydrochloric acid if you start throwing up. And so if you're only losing the acid from vomiting profusely for like a while, that hydrochloric acid, you get a chloride shift and all this stuff happens. And essentially your body can become, from losing all that acid and chloride, your body can become very alkalotic. And so that could cause a left shift. Maybe the other most common one would just be something that makes you really cold. So a hypothermia. Hypothermia, everywhere is cold, and there's not a lot of metabolism going on. And so if the body senses that everything is really cold, kind of go back to that regional example, it's like the body doesn't know, is this area doing work or not? Like, does it need oxygen? The metabolism is slowed down. It's not really putting off any CO2, and it's really cold over here. Doesn't seem like a place that we should drop any oxygen off. So those would be two more common ones. You could have other things that they ingest, maybe an antacid overdose. That's, when
A
does that
Tums
happen?
overdose.
Yeah, Tums over. I don't know. Like, I've never seen one before. I guess we could ask the Dan and Howard if they've ever seen an antacid overdose or something. But maybe a toxidrome could cause a metabolic alkalosis. But yeah, not super common. It's not like hyperventilation, I guess, would be another common one. Or we do it, iatrogenic. You just overventilate somebody and you blow off too much CO2, and that can cause an issue, which is maybe where we should focus on next. But yeah, there are a few things that can cause a global alkalosis, and that can stop perfusion. And actually, it's kind of it's tougher to deal with, I feel like, an alkalosis. We're very used to acidosis, but alkalosis can trick you quite a bit. When you think about an alkalosis, because the hemoglobin are saturated because they're not dropping it off anywhere, the bad thing about an alkalosis is that you look at their SpO2 and you're like, oh, sweet. Like, the SpO2 looks really good. And
Mhm.
look, they're not retaining CO2. I put the end tidal CO2 on and look, it's really low, and they're breathing really good. They got plenty of oxygen, and they got not too much CO2. Seems like I've got some room to play here, right? Like, if I had to intubate this patient, then their SpO2 would be great and I wouldn't have to worry about the CO2 building up, right? But in actuality, none of that oxygen is getting delivered off at tissues, it's stuck to the hemoglobin. It's not it's not going anywhere. So I feel like an alkalosis might be more, it's more nuanced. Like it's difficult. It's more difficult to pick up on because the SpO2 looks good, and so after you see the good SpO2, you're like, where do I go from here? Like, is anything actually wrong with this patient?
So if you had a patient that was in cardiac arrest and you pushed bicarbonate, and not just one, but let's say you go nutty nuts. Let's just say you're Eric Rima and you're just pushing tons and tons of sodium
Right, right.
bicarbonate.
One
Do you
one
think
amp for
that
every
that
one
would
of his Facebook posts.
Do you think that that would make somebody favor a right shift or a left shift? Because you got two things going
Um,
on. You have the increase in CO2, and then you also have an increase in bicarbonate.
yeah. Let me think about that for a second. I wasn't prepared for that question. So the bicarbonate, the sodium bicarbonate itself contains CO2 in it. So that's, you're going to see some of that bicarbonate gets shifted immediately through carbonic acid buffering system to make CO2. So that is going to happen. The other thing that's going to happen is that amp actually has like CO2. It has a CO2 load of its own in there as well. So the CO2 is going to increase a small amount. So I feel like that would a little bit, very temporarily, I feel like would give you a more of a right shift just because that CO2 is present, and that is the rule. If the CO2 is present, that should shift you over to the right further. But I don't think it's going to have any lasting effects on your actual like pH to change too much of the acid base status, because it's either going to buffer, and the other thing is it's obviously held in place by the strong ion difference, weak acids, and the CO2 concentration that's going to get blown off. So maybe I could be wrong about this. I don't know, but I think very temporarily it'd shift you to the right a little bit, and then probably you'd end up right back where you started. I think is what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really hard to get out of a right shift in a cardiac arrest. Like you're starting pretty far right in a cardiac arrest, and then when you think about the decreased cardiac output, you're not getting the best cardiac output with chest compressions either. So I know there's some people that argue like, oh, you don't want to give sodium bicarbonate in an arrest because it'll shift them to the left, and then the cells won't get that oxygen. I don't think that that's the reason not to give sodium bicarbonate in arrest. We got a whole list of other reasons why it's the AHA no
Yeah.
longer
Oh, they
recommends
think
it.
that's what people think, is it's going to shift you too
I've
far to
heard
the
that
left.
argument. Yeah, I have heard
Oh,
that argument that
oh man, no, I don't think if sodium bicarb worked that well, we'd probably actually use it. I, I think that the CO2 would shift you a little bit. It does have a crazy strong ion difference. So yeah, I mean there is, it could shift you to the left, but I think the strong ions are going to kind of hold it where it is. I would not, that would not be my concern, is shifting them too far to the left when their body isn't getting, they're in like an anaerobic metabolism, and this
yeah,
creating
I
a much
agree.
acid. I mean, we see what's stuck in their body when we get ROSC. Think of all that CO2 that always comes back, you know? So all that is stuck out there. That's gonna, to me, that's gonna influence the pH and the curve, the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, more than a couple amps of sodium bicarb. Again, I could be wrong on that, but that's my feeling on it, is that all that CO2 that's floating around and the anaerobic metabolism is vastly more influential than a couple amps of bicarbonate that we're going to give them.
Yeah, so you and I are working on this CO2 clinic that we got coming up on June 18th, which if you guys haven't seen that, go on foamfrat.com/ETCO2 clinic, and you'll see the landing page for that. But we were talking, we've really just been diving deep into CO2 clearance and mitochondria and the production. And it's interesting how CO2 is transported, because some of it is transported just in the plasma, which is not a whole lot. The majority of it is actually transported as bicarbonate. And then some
Yeah.
of it is transported on hemoglobin, right? And I know you remember the percentages. I can't remember what those are.
Yeah, they're approximate, and I'd read a couple textbooks that had different numbers, but the way that I'm going to frame it is a roundabout numbers. It's not exact. It's probably like 10% in the plasma, probably about 20% attached to subunits on hemoglobin, different sites than where oxygen binds. You have these subunits, the alpha and beta subunits that come off, probably about 20%. And then I'm just going to say remaining 70-ish percent, probably bicarbonate.
Because what I was wondering is if you have somebody who's on a left shift and they are not getting rid of the oxygen, and we'll say that it's still it would be in a tense state then, right? If it's still got oxygen on it and we're in a left shift,
Relaxed. Yeah, it's if it still has oxygen on it, it's in a relaxed state.
a
Oxygen,
relaxed state.
yeah, hemoglobin likes that oxygen. It kind of like, yeah, that's its calm, like relaxed
And
state.
so then once it gives off the oxygen, it's in a tense state
Yeah.
until 2,3-DPG binds
Yep.
to the alpha subunit.
Mhm.
Or is it the beta subunit? I don't remember. But
Yeah, I think it's got its own receptor.
until 2,3-DPG jumps onto that hemoglobin, then
Mhm.
it's still in that like tense state, right? So imagine
Yeah.
you have all these oxygen molecules on the hemoglobin and it's
Mhm.
circulating around and it's not getting rid of that oxygen. That's going to increase the amount of CO2 that's being transported in the plasma or in the bicarbonate, right?
Mhm.
Because it can't. Do you think that you would see an increase in your PCO2 in a left shift because it's going to increase the plasma partial pressure of CO2, or do you think that bicarbonate will just pick up the slack on that? You like all
There
these extra
is.
questions that I'm just thinking of while we're.
Let me think about that. So, would the PCO2, so since the oxygen, since it's not being transported on the hemoglobin, would the partial pressure, I think that the bicarbonate, as long as the cardiac output is good and there's bicarbonate present, I think that that's going to pick up the slack. That might be, because I don't totally have an answer to that, that might be a clever way of the body, if there is a buildup of CO2 in that tissue, that might be a clever way of the body to shift it back to the right to get that oxygen off of there.
That
So
was
I
my
think it's
thoughts. That's what I was wondering is if
yeah,
that would be how the body would correct that is because you're not going to be able to transport the CO2 on hemoglobin. While it's not a ton, the majority of it is as bicarbonate.
mhm,
Would that slowly bring that correction back to a normal spot on the curve?
yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it would. It's
I
just kind of
think it
fun to
would.
think about.
Yeah. I think it would. Cuz and two, like I don't think it would really build up cuz yeah, it can float in the plasma, and then as long as there's bicarbonate and actual cardiac output occurring, I think it would be okay, but if it does build up, I think it would be enough to flip that over to the right where it would actually drop that oxygen off, hopefully, unless it's really bound on there for some pathological reason.
Cool, man. Dude, I'm not gonna bombard you with any more weird
Well,
questions.
I do have one more thing I want to talk about because this was something that this was one of the things that got me interested in the curve, re-interested in it to do a deep dive on it in the first place was the patient that has um, a low CO2. So you got a patient, they're working really hard to breathe, right? And they're moving these huge tidal volumes. And so, in and out, and they're blowing off all this CO2, but they're not onboarding oxygen very well. Or maybe they're not dropping it off. And this was something that people would message me about. They would send me ABGs of a patient that's on a left shift, specifically COVID patients. And these COVID patients would have high SpO2s, but their PO2s would be trash, and they'd be on this left curve for some reason. And people would send me these ABGs. And there's other patients that you could think of like that are on this left shift. Just think of anybody who's working really hard to breathe. The oxygen's okay. They're really dumping this CO2 off. The question comes in if the patient should go on BiPAP, CPAP, if they should receive bag valve mask ventilations, whatever the case is. And in those patients, if the patient's on a really far left shift already, you might not want to use BiPAP on those patients because you're going to be blowing off way more. And that's the reason I bring this up is it's kind of the hospital standard. Or if people have BiPAP pre-hospital, they tend to always default that because they're like, oh, it's going to help out the work of breathing. It's going to, help them on the way in and then, kind of relax on the way out. But there could be a time and a place for CPAP as well. If you don't want that patient to move any further to the left and they have good respiratory effort, that might be the patient that you put on regular old CPAP with no inspiratory support, not BiPAP, CPAP, instead of exacerbating that left shift, moving more minute volume, which is going to expel more CO2, drive them further to the left, and decrease oxygen delivery even more, which might be their problem in the first place. So I just wanted to bring that up. That's something that's come up in a lot of classes, like CPAP versus BiPAP when you do certain ones, and actually the hemoglobin curve. If you can figure out what that pathology is and kind of look at the PO2 versus the SpO2 and figure out is this patient shifting a certain way or do they have a clinical presentation that makes me think they're right or left, you might be able to make a more informed decision about the type of non-invasive ventilation that you select. And if you don't want to exacerbate that left shift, and as long as they seem like they don't need inspiratory support, CPAP might be the answer for that. And I think that's pretty rare in a hospital to choose CPAP over BiPAP, but there is a place for it.
I've seen that before in CHF patients because CO2, what do they say, is like 20 times more soluble in
Something like that,
water
yeah.
and fluid. Obviously that doesn't apply to like pneumonia and gunk and boogers and stuff, but I have seen where the CO2 levels are super low and the SpO2 is super low. And you're like, oh, okay, what's going on here? This is interesting because it's not like it's your typical VQ mismatch where you're retaining some of that CO2. And obviously in a CHF patient, CPAP works very well for that as well. So you got to look at, all right, what is their minute volume right now? And am I going to increase their minute volume by putting them on non-invasive? And, I would say if they're that far on the left shift or they're hyperventilating that much and your PCO2s are super low, then that's probably not the right move.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned PCO2 because there's about a million reasons that your end tidal CO2 could be low. So you don't want to assume just because an end tidal CO2 can be low for 3 reasons. They're breathing off too much, they're not making it, or there's a VQ mismatch. And that last one is a real kicker because the only reasons the only reason a PaCO2 would be low or PCO2 would be low would be if you're getting rid of too much or if you're not making it. The PaCO2, if it's low, it's not going to be influenced by like a VQ mismatch because it's only going to want to go out, right? It could build up if there's a bad VQ mismatch and get high, and you could have a respiratory acidosis. But if it's low, you're either not making it or you're blowing it off. End tidal CO2 has those two plus VQ mismatch, and that VQ mismatch is the reason that you can't say, oh, look, the end tidal CO2 is low, they must have a really low PCO2. Doesn't work that way. It can work the opposite. Low PCO2, low end tidal CO2 doesn't, unfortunately, with the stuff we monitor live, doesn't go the other way too. And you can say end tidal CO2 low, PaCO2 low. You just got to be really careful for that and not make super critical decisions about a patient's status based solely off that end tidal CO2, because while it is an amazing tool, it's got its problems as well.
Yeah, and also we talk PCO2 and PO2s, but in that patient that's hyperventilating that much and working that hard to breathe, super important to look at like your pH, your bicarbonate values to make sure they're not compensating for a metabolic acidosis on top of that, because that's the patient that you do want to try to keep that minute volume up and try to allow them to blow that off. So don't just think, oh man, this must be a hyperventilation scenario. Let's just use CPAP in a patient that's got a metabolic acidosis.
Isn't alkalosis hard? Alkalosis is like one of those things where, is this pathologic where I need to actually intervene on this? Or is this compensatory? Because if it's compensatory and I try to correct it, I've really super screwed up bad. But if it's pathological and this is a primary alkalosis, you don't want to exacerbate it further or support it. It really, funky stuff goes on with those alkaloses. Luckily, we deal with mostly acidosis, but when you do get tossed a weird alkalosis patient, you got to really examine, what is this, compensatory or is it primary? I guess primary, secondary. And then what should I do about it? So you need more information than just, a PCO2 or bicarbonate to make that decision. You're going to have a few parameters and look at the whole patient picture to really figure out where should you go with that patient.
Yeah, well, you know what? We only have so much time on Lipson for our podcast, so we're at 35 minutes, man. Is there anything we should say before we head out? Because you said I could end it with
desaturation isn't linear or live.
Here, keep going.
You want me? No, you rap over it. I think we should make a separate video for the what's it called?
We will.
Yeah,
let's kick it.
We should do that real professional. No, desaturation isn't linear or live. Right shift, left shift can be pathologic or physiologic. It can be local or systemic. So, got to look at a lot of stuff to figure out which is which. And I think that's all the take-home points that I got. I can barely hear it now. It's drifting further away from the microphone.
Hey, you're editing this one. You can do whatever you want with this video, man.
I'm basically going to take this segment and just put it on repeat for the entire podcast.
All right, dude. We'll see you later.
See ya.